There are occasions in life when something happens which changes your whole worldview. So much changed for me at that wedding in Cana that it is only now, looking back years later, that things have begun to fit into place. I suppose as the years go by, we try to make sense of what has gone before in the light of our life experience. I was just a young servant back then, steeped, of course, in the faith of my ancestors. I knew my scriptures. It had always been there in my life from my very earliest days. We were a devout family. We lived a simple life, had all we needed. Servanthood was in our family genes. There's no shame about being a servant, and I have always been fortunate in my masters. We all have different gifts, but it's the same God who has given them to us and activates them in us. Being a good and faithful servant is as good a gift as another. But I digress. That wedding, what a day. It began normally enough, I suppose, the happy couple surrounded by vast numbers of family and friends. I recognised most of the locals as I stood around waiting for instruction from the steward. Of course, the whole community had been invited, as they always are. Life seems to be one big party for some of them. There were quite a few from Nazareth, which I suppose wasn't that surprising given its proximity to our little village of Cana. I don't know many of the Nazareth crowd, but I remember noticing the group of 12 or so young men and women who arrived together and stayed chatting together as the day drew on. There was an older woman with them. I remember thinking that she was probably the mother of one of them. Did she know the bride and groom, or was she there to keep an eye on things? So there we all were, watching from the sidelines in case we were needed for anything, standing as we servants usually did in the corner of the room by where the stone water jars are kept. It was then that we first heard the rumour that the wine had run out. Such a calamity would be social ruin for the newly married couple. If they couldn't supply the hospitality, which is such a key part of our Jewish life, they would have a very rocky start to their married life. How could this have happened? Did someone under order? Were there too many gate crashers? What a disaster. We servants couldn't stop chattering about it, despite a stern look from the steward. Anyway, there seemed to be some sort of commotion in the group of young men from Nazareth. The older woman and one of the men were having a heated conversation. It looked as if she was telling him to do something he didn't want to do. She must be his mother, I thought. And then, quite unexpectedly, she came towards us. "Do whatever he tells you," she said. We looked at one another, confused and, to be honest, rather scared and apprehensive. We took our orders from the steward, not from some random young man from Nazareth. But here he was, following behind. He had a certain authority to him in the way he approached us, which was at the same time disarming and reassuring. "Fill the jars with water," he said. Nothing else. As if water would solve the problem. But we did as he told us. I thought the steward would intervene, demanding to know what we were doing, meddling with the purification jars. But he seemed as transfixed as the rest of us. So we did what the young man said, filling the jars to the brim with water. It was definitely water. I know it was, because I did the filling. And when we had filled them, This young man from Nazareth told us to draw some out and take it to the steward. Well, I was nearest, so I picked up a drinking vessel, dipped it into one of the jars, and this is the weirdest thing. I saw it was filled with sweet wine. I handed it silently to the steward. I don't think I could have said anything, even if I had tried. I was stunned, speechless. The steward looked pretty shaken too, after he had tasted what was in the vessel. He gave me a very strange look, but he recovered his composure. I was very impressed with that, and handed it to the bridegroom with those words which I'll never forget. You have kept the good wine until now. I looked around for the young man from Nazareth, but he was back with his friends. They were patting him on the back and congratulating him for saving the day and calling him special and full of glory. I heard one of them say, "Well, mate, we believe in you now," which struck me as a rather odd thing to say. Some wedding that was. Memorable doesn't even capture half of it. Life-changing, more like. Because after that day, I heard more and more about the young man from Nazareth. I discovered his name and began to realize that I had been part of something very, very special, a miracle. Well, some called it a sign. His first sign, they said. There were others to come, feeding 5,000 hungry people, calming a violent storm, even bringing someone back from the dead. I often wondered why he began by turning water into wine. I think it is perhaps a picture of all that he came to do. He took what was there, the empty jars, and showed that it could be something else, something which is tired, worn out, empty of joy and lacking in purpose, can be transformed. It can be turned into something rich, fragrant, and full of joy through his presence. It seems to me that this is about us, you and me, far more than about water jars and wine. And I think, too, it was about abundance, the abundance of God's love for us. That young man from Nazareth said himself later on, "I come to give life, life in abundance." The guests went from having no wine at all to having gallons and gallons of it. He provided more, much more than we needed. And it was a wedding feast. All good Jews know that marriage is a symbol of the relationship between God and his people. It's in the writing of the prophet Isaiah. The prophet tells us that God will take delight in his people, just like a groom and his bride. For as a young man marries a young woman, and as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. Do whatever he tells you, his mother said to us. And we did. We were part of the miraculous thing which happened. That is what faith is all about. Responding to the words of Jesus, trusting that his word will be fulfilled, trusting that as he transformed the water into wine, so he will transform us and lead us into the kingdom where the best wine is yet to come. And that's how that day changed my life forever.